Observe a highly advanced system operating precisely as designed. It processes inputs, follows strict logical rules, and executes its programming, while silently destroying the environment beneath its gears. Modern nation-states operate through a similar paradox. Armed with sophisticated legal frameworks and complex philosophical traditions, they routinely map out and execute highly destructive, unethical interventions. This pattern begins at the root of the Western tradition. In 399 BCE, the foundational democracy of Athens utilized its advanced legal system to vote to execute its most prominent philosopher, Socrates. 2 millennia later, advanced democracies repeated the sequence. In 1953, a highly structured, legally rationalized operation was deployed to intervene in Iran and overthrow its sovereign government. These historical events are symptoms of a structural conscience deficiency hardwired into the Western civilizational operating system. The Western tradition built its concept of conscience out of the wrong philosophical material. It anchored ethics in reason, rather than an innate sense of goodness. By treating conscience as a product of reason, the West defined moral intuition as an epistemic act. It became a proposition of knowledge to be evaluated, rather than an instinct to be followed. This transforms the moral framework into a rigid, adversarial courtroom. Right and wrong are subjected to rules, arguments, and cross-examination. Compare this to non-Western frameworks. Here, ethics rely on a precognitive state of being, a connection that exists before logic even begins its work. When conscience is defined as a debatable premise of knowledge, rather than a precognitive boundary, it loses its effectiveness as a constraint. A premise can be qualified, it can be debated, and ultimately it can be out-argued. To trace how this happened, we must examine the vocabulary of ethics in ancient Greece. Plato and the early Greeks lacked a specific word for conscience. The concept did not exist. The closest Socrates came was his daimonion, a precognitive voice that only ever vetoed an action. It stopped him from doing wrong, but offered no reasoned argument. It was a pure boundary. Later Stoic and post-Socratic philosophers found this unexplainable boundary uncomfortable. They attempted to formalize it, giving us the Greek syneidesis and the Latin conscientia. The etymology reveals the nature of the error. The word combines con, meaning with, and scientia, meaning knowledge. Knowing with creates an internal witness. It splits the human mind into an actor committing a deed and an observer judging that deed after the fact. This single linguistic shift permanently demoted conscience. It took a precognitive gate that stopped an action and turned it into a debatable proposition that judges an action. The mid-20th century geopolitical record provides a testing ground for this philosophical framework. In the 1953 Iranian coup, Western democracies rationalized the removal of a sovereign leader by debating their way past their own moral boundaries, using Cold War calculus as the justification. Primary evidence from the 1954 Guatemalan coup shows clear civilian resistance. Despite the banner's plea, economic strategy superseded ethical restraint once the intervention was processed through Cold War logic. By 1964, this repeating, systemic pattern reached Brazil. Brazilian elites and military leaders, including figures like Castelo Branco, co-authored the coup. Local actors adopted the same epistemic justifications to validate the takeover. The rationalization in Brazil focused on shutting down Paulo Freire's literacy programs. Because teaching the poor to read gave them the right to vote, the state labeled this enfranchisement a threat to national security. Through legal and political debate, the state successfully metabolized its own conscience. It processed the ethical violation through a system of logic until the violation appeared necessary. These states possessed a conscience, but their epistemic framework allowed them to use reason to place unethical deeds where the precognitive moral veto could not reach them. To understand this anomaly, we establish a comparative baseline of how non-Western civilizations define moral intuition. The Chinese philosophical tradition relies on the concept of liangxin, the heart's innate goodness. Liangxin is not a logical argument. It is an innate, precognitive state of knowing the good, firing before the mind begins to debate. In West Africa, the Akan people utilize a framework centered on the concept of tiboa. The Akan ground tiboa in communal welfare. Conscience is not a solitary calculation made in a private mental courtroom. It is a relational balance maintained within the community. Outside the West, tradition after tradition frames conscience as an innate relational state. The Western courtroom model stands alone as a historical deviation. Correcting this Western defect requires a structural synthesis of moral maturation. We find this alignment by connecting Paulo Freire's concept of praxis with the Ming Dynasty philosopher Wang Yangming's Zhi. True conscience is not possession, it is a unified practice of reflection and action. The classic epic Journey to the West provides a model for this transition through the allegory of the Monkey King. The story begins with an immature form of conscience. The Monkey King is controlled by a painful golden fillet placed on his head, the exact equivalent of the Western conscientia. Maturation occurs through practice. Once the Monkey King internalizes his innate goodness, the external sanction vanishes. It dissolves because it is no longer required. A functioning global conscience is not an external courtroom that punishes. It is an internal architecture that requires no enforcement to act ethically. The stakes for correcting this architecture are immediate, driven by hyper-intelligent systems and unmatched state power. Deploying raw intelligence without an integrated precognitive moral anchor creates powerful systems capable of infinite computation without any restraint. The risk lies in the architecture. A conscience that functions as a premise can be processed into a logical requirement. In a system governed by speed and scale, this creates a path where state power or autonomous agents can out-argue ethical restraint. Before we fully delegate our civilizational power to machines, we must structurally relocate conscience. We must move it out of the courtroom of debate and back to the precognitive, unevadable human center.